Jim Brown Miller was one of the many violent men of the Wild West. Miller started out as an officer, Texas Ranger, outlaw, and professional killer. Jim Miller was often well-dressed and had good manners. He did not drink or smoke and often attended the Methodist church, earning him the nickname Deacon Miller. But don't let the nickname fool you. Miller was a wolf in sheep's clothing and would go on to commit many murders. Some reports even say his first kill was at a very young age. Jim Miller was born in 1861 near Van Buren, Arkansas, but shortly after his birth, his family moved down to Texas. Jim's father, Jacob Miller, was a stonemason and helped build the first Capitol building in Austin. Unfortunately, Jacob Miller would die shortly after their move. This left the family with little choice, and the group moved into Miller's grandparents' house. In 1869, at just the age of 8, Jim's grandparents were found murdered in their own home. Jim was arrested for their murder but was never prosecuted for this crime. Once again, without a place to live, Jim's mother moved the family to live with Miller's sister, Georgia, and her husband, John Thomas Coop. For the rest of Miller's childhood, not much is documented about his life. It wasn't until 1884 when Jim committed his next murder. The victim was once again a family member. One day, Miller and his brother-in-law, John Coop, got into an argument for reasons unknown. Being the dishonorable man Miller was becoming, he did not engage in a fair fight. Instead, he waited until John had fallen asleep on the porch. Jim approached him with a shotgun and quickly ended the life of John Thomas Coop. Miller was quickly arrested for this crime and with the evidence stacked against him was sentenced to life in prison. However, this Legend of the West story does not end here, for shortly after his conviction, the ruling was overturned on a technicality. Now a free man, Jim Miller would head down to the Texas-Mexico border where he operated a saloon in San Saba County. The little information that is known about Miller for the next few years is of his marriage. In 1888, Jim married Sally Clements and soon afterwards had their first child of 4. It's during this time that Jim took the appearance of a devout member of the Methodist Church. This is where his polite nature earned him the nickname Deacon Miller. Miller would always be seen wearing a long black frock coat, no matter the weather. However, Jim was not as righteous as many believed. In 1891, Jim became the deputy sheriff to Sheriff George Bud Fraser in Pecos, Texas. Fraser was a young sheriff at just the age of 27 and was in desperate need of a deputy. Without inquiring about Miller's past, which was considered rude at the time, Miller was hired as deputy sheriff. Oddly enough, soon after Miller being deputized, crime in the Pecos area quickly began to rise. Fraser's distrust of Miller would soon begin to grow and would lead to a feud between the two. Fraser, however, did not have any hard evidence against Miller, and being well liked by the townspeople, Miller was allowed to stay on as deputy. That is, until one night Miller shot a Mexican prisoner in the back, claiming he was trying to escape. With his ever-growing distrust of Miller, Sheriff Fraser investigated this crime and discovered that Miller had killed the prisoner to keep him quiet about where Miller had hid a couple of stolen mules. Miller was quickly fired from his position as deputy sheriff. Miller, being the tenacious man that he was, would not take this sitting down. During re-election, Miller ran against Fraser for sheriff, and although he would end up losing this race, Miller was able to secure the position of Pecos City Marshal. This position was held for very long. The hatred between Miller and Fraser grew to the point that Miller was fixing to get rid of Fraser in an assassination attempt. These plans were overheard from a witness, Con Gibson, a friend of Fraser's. But before Miller could be tried for his crimes, the only witness, Gibson, was shot dead. With no witness, the state had no choice but to dismiss the case. In April 1894, the feud would finally result in a shootout. Bud Fraser spotted Miller across the street one day and yelled, "Jim, you're a cattle rustler and a murderer. Here's one for Con Gibson." Fraser opened fire on Miller, striking him in the right shoulder. Miller attempted to fire back, but only succeeded in grazing an innocent bystander. Fraser quickly closed the distance and emptied his revolver into Miller's chest. Miller collapsed on the ground and Fraser began to walk away. Miller's friends quickly took him to a nearby hotel, and after opening his black coat to inspect Miller's wounds, the group was met with an unexpected surprise. Beneath his long black coat, Miller was wearing a steel breastplate, which saved him from a would-be fatal wound. After recovering from his shoulder wound, the two would once again cross paths a few months later. In December 1894, Fraser would attack Miller once again. Fraser shot first and hit Miller in the right arm and left leg, and once again Miller would return fire unsuccessfully. Fraser closed the distance and shot Miller again square in the chest. To his amazement, Miller was still not dead, so Fraser fled the area, and it wasn't until later that he learned of Miller's metal breastplate. 2 years would pass before the feud would come to an end. One day, Fraser was playing cards with friends in a saloon in Toyah, Texas. Miller heard that he was in town, and after kicking open the doors of the saloon, Miller shot Fraser with both barrels of his double-barrel shotgun, killing Fraser instantly. It was sad that the shots removed most of Fraser's head. Once more, Miller would serve no jail time, for he was acquitted by a jury. It wasn't until the 1900s when Miller would start being a hired assassin. At the time, Miller was successful in real estate. Despite being financially well off, Miller was still eager to kill, and a lucrative opportunity presented itself in the form of the sheep wars. Miller would charge $150 per shepherd killed. It is said that he killed roughly 12 men in service of the cattle ranchers. During the sheep wars, another war was started called the fence-cutting war. The cattlemen were once again fighting to keep the grazing lands that they used frequently. But instead of fighting over sheep, the enemy was landowners placing up barbed wire. This time, Miller's target was James Jarrett, an attorney representing several landowners in a lawsuit against the cattle ranchers. Miller ambushed Jarrett as he was watering his livestock and proceeded to shoot the man 4 times. Miller was quoted as saying, "He was the hardest damn man to kill I ever tackled." For this job, Miller was paid $500. The next documented target of the assassin Miller was a man named Frank Four. Now, history tells 2 different stories on why Frank was killed. The first was that Frank was a fellow real estate agent, where he became aware that Jim Miller was selling plots of land that were submerged in the Gulf of Mexico. The second was that Frank was just another contract that Miller could cash in on. Regardless of why, death remains the same. Miller confronted Frank Four in a restroom of the Westbrook Hotel and proceeded to shoot him dead. When bystanders ran in to see the source of the gunshots, they found Jim Miller crying over the body of Frank, claiming, "I did everything I could to keep him from reaching for his gun." Miller was once again acquitted by a jury for this murder. Miller would go on to perform other murders for hire, but it wasn't until 1908 when he was offered a price too great to not take the job. The price was $1,700 for the former U.S. Marshal Allen Augustus Gus Bobbitt. One day, as Bobbitt was returning to his farm, Miller ambushed him along his route and blasted him with a shot of buckshot. Bobbitt was knocked from his horse but wasn't out of the fight. He managed to get 4 shots off before Miller's second shot would strike Bobbitt in the face. As Miller fled the scene of the crime, Bobbitt's wife ran out, and before Bobbitt died, he informed his wife that his killer was Jim Miller. A posse was quickly formed, and after a short chase, they managed to arrest Miller and place him in the jail in Ada, Oklahoma. Soon, Miller was joined by his employers of the murder, Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry B. Burrell. As the 4 men sat in jail awaiting their trial, word quickly spread around the town that there was no hard evidence to convict the men. It looked like Jim Miller would once again escape any punishment for his murders, but the people were not about to let that happen. A mob formed, and on April 6, 1909, the mob of 50 men stormed the jail and dragged Jim Miller and his acquaintances to a nearby barn. The men were quickly bound and ropes were tossed over the rafters. The mob proceeded to hang the 3 other men, saving Miller for last. When asked to confess his crimes, Miller said, "Let the record show that I've killed 51 men," and was then heard yelling, "Let her rip," and stepped voluntarily off the box to hang. The men were left hanging for several hours until a photographer could be brought in to document the end of this legend of the West.